Okay, welcome to the fourth and final video on the first part of the Euthyphro. In this video, I want to discuss how the introduction of the forms allows for a more complete, deeper, fuller response to the paradox of inquiry. But before I turn to that issue, I want to point out how in this version of the recollection argument, we get a powerful argument for our exciting idea, namely that what we know far outstrips what we can learn through the senses. So in sensation, we can only come into contact with sensible, imperfect things, right? Sensible, imperfect characteristics, sensible, imperfect Fs, the little Fs, right? And we might wonder, like, well, why think that there is the equal itself? Why think that there is this form of perfect equality? Well, it's because we exhibit this ability that seems to go beyond anything that we've taken in through the senses. What do I have in mind? Well, after you recognize a few cases of equal things, right? Two pieces of chalk, sticks, the amount of water in 2 glasses, you acquire an ability that goes beyond these few cases, right? You form a concept, a general notion of equality that can apply to any kind of equal things that you might come across. So you'll be able to recognize all sorts of new cases as either equal or unequal. And these might be very different from the kinds of cases that you've so far considered. So maybe you've never come across the comparison of 2 equal weights. You've only been comparing lengths, maybe colors, etc. But now you come across weights and you wonder, are these weights equal? And it's you can extend the concept of equality very easy in that direction. Or all of a sudden you're asked to compare in your chemistry class 2 volumes of air. You're asked to decide whether or not these are equal. Maybe you've never tried to compare volumes of air before, but you have no problem in adapting your concept of equality and applying it to volumes of air. Or take another example. Take the example of being taught to add. I mean, this is an ability that goes beyond any collection of the instances of added that you can think up, right? I mean, in your lifetime, you've only done some finite number of addition problems. And yet you have this ability to add that goes well beyond those finite problems that you've done, right? I could give you any 2 numbers whatsoever, and you could figure out their sum, given enough time. And so you have an ability that goes far beyond anything that you've encountered through the senses. And so in this way, the forms go beyond all the sensible beings and properties that exemplify the forms. They're the foundation of an ability that far outstrips anything that we could have encountered in the senses. Okay, so now I want to turn to the paradox of inquiry and how the forms give us a fuller answer, a more complete answer to the paradox of inquiry. And the way that I want to come at this is to the question of how do we get knowledge of the forms, of equality, of justice, etc. And there's a kind of ambiguity in this question. I mean, there are 2 things that I could be asking, right? I could be asking, how do we get the forms before we're born? And how do we get the knowledge that we have in this life, right? So there's in this life and originally. And what I mean is really the second. I mean, this is what I'm interested in. This is what we can really know about. Socrates, I mean, Plato doesn't really talk about how this happens. presumably it's not sensible because all of the knowledge that we get through the senses is imperfect. So there's got to be some kind of purely intellectual contact that we come into with the forms before we're born. But we forget all that. So there's not much to say about it. And so Plato doesn't pay very much attention to it. But he does pay quite a bit of attention to the kind of knowledge that we have in this life of the forms. And that's going to give us our solution to the paradox of inquiry. So he thinks there are really two kinds of knowledge that we can have of the forms. There's a kind of strong knowledge of the forms, and there's a kind of latent knowledge of the forms. And by strong knowledge of the forms, he means we'll be able to give an account of the characteristic in question. And he lays this out at 76b. What does he mean by being able to give an account of the F in question, the form in question, the thing in question? Well, generally what he means is that we'll be able to defend a definition of F when under the pressure of dialectic. So for example, if we had this kind of strong knowledge of piety, right, then we would have a definition of it that we could defend under pressure. So if Euthyphro really knew, had the strong knowledge of piety, then he would be able to give an account of it to Socrates. And then when Socrates asked him questions, Socrates wouldn't be able to drive him into contradiction, right? It would be stable. It would last, this knowledge. It would have a kind of fixity where it wouldn't just collapse under the first couple questions, right? And if we had this kind of knowledge, then we would know what piety is, right? We would be able to answer the question, what is it? We would know its nature. We would be able to explain its nature. We would even know its essence, right? We would know what it is in itself such that it is this way, right? We would be able to give a complete explanation of it. And Socrates thinks this kind of knowledge is hard to achieve. He thinks we don't usually get there. He thinks mathematics can give us our best model of this kind of knowledge. I mean, mathematics is really the case where we can get an example of what this kind of knowledge is. So we can give this kind of account of something like equality. But we're not going to be able to give this kind of account, at least very easily. Socrates has never met anybody who can do it, with things like piety or justice or beauty. Nonetheless, Plato thinks there is a kind of knowledge that we can have of piety, justice, and beauty. And it's a kind of knowledge that we're going to have of really every kind of characteristic that there is. And that's going to be this second kind of knowledge, this latent knowledge. And we exhibit this kind of knowledge all the time in our everyday judgments. And so when we come into contact with a perfect example of an existing thing that has a property that is F, then we're reminded of the form F, right? The form is stirred up in our minds, and then we're able to judge that this thing that we've come into contact with is F. So, for example, we see the sticks, that reminds us of the equal, right? We see the equal sticks, that reminds us of the equal, and then we're able to make this judgment. These sticks are equal. And so there we're exhibiting a kind of latent knowledge of equality, right? A kind of everyday knowledge of equality that allows us to make judgments like these sticks are equal. And this kind of a knowledge this kind of knowledge, it's not shown through the ability to be able to give an account, but it's shown through our abilities to make these everyday judgments, right? We're able to tell immediately whether two sticks are of equal length. And so we've got to have some latent knowledge of equality that grounds this ability, that makes this ability possible, even though we can't necessarily give an account, even though we don't have the full kind of knowledge that we're after when we're asking what piety is, or when we what we really want out of knowledge, right? And so it's the second kind of knowledge of F's, of piety, of the equal, that Socrates thinks we generally have. And because the forms are perfect standards that we can start using to understand the world we sense as soon as we're born, he thinks we must have had this knowledge, this latent knowledge, or this knowledge of the forms before we were born, because we start applying the forms, we start exhibiting this latent knowledge of the forms at birth. And so this kind of latent knowledge is the kind of knowledge that we see all the time, that everybody's got. So how does this help us? How does this help us solve the paradox of inquiry? I mean, you pause the video and see if you can think of the answer. I mean, it should be pretty clear at this point. So pause the video. Okay, spoiler. I'm gonna start going into it. The idea is, right, this kind of latent knowledge that's what we need to search. Right? I've got to know what beauty is in order to be able to go out searching for an account of it. Right? So I have to have latent knowledge of beauty to be able to go out and search. I've got to know what piety is in order to be able to go out and search for it. So it's the weaker kind of knowledge that I need for that. But then it's the stronger kind of knowledge that I'm looking for. So the strong knowledge is what I'm looking for. And so the way that inquiry is possible is because, well, we start with this kind of latent knowledge, and that gives us the knowledge we need to go searching, but we don't have the kind of strong knowledge, so we don't have what we're searching after, right? And so for that reason, we can search for what we don't know because we don't have the strong knowledge yet, and we can search for what we already know latently because we don't have the strong knowledge, right? So we already know enough about it to go searching because we have the latent knowledge. So there you go. That's the resolution to the paradox of inquiry.